So let me try to pick up where we were last Friday. We were talking about something that most of you will never deal with, called a request for information. And it's something that we throw out there because it's part of what is called performance-based contracting. And although most of you will never use it, as I said, in 31 years of doing procurement, I've done this twice. So if I've done it twice, it's not something that I would expect most other people to do, but it's something you should be aware of, both for what it can do and what it can't do and shouldn't do, etc. And one of the things I want to mention, which is not actually in the slides because I thought of it after I went through this last Friday, and so when this is done again, I will probably add a couple more slides, what I would call the alternatives to requests for information. Because if you remember, I said basically these are problematic because of the circumstances that you can get into a situation of if a vendor gives you information, more than generic information, and you look at that information and you like it, and so you put that in specifications, there's always the possibility that some other vendor will recognize that those specifications were unique to a particular vendor and challenge them and say that it was assisting with specifications, and so it could come to the situation the vendor that was nice enough to respond can be barred from receiving an award. Now, not to say that that is a highly likely scenario, but it's at least a possibility. And so we said to avoid that possibility, either don't do an RFI or just be very, very careful of how you construct it, which most people, since there have been no rules, there are no rules. Again, I said if you look in COMAR, you will not find requests for information even mentioned. And so since it's not mentioned, there's nothing that tells you, all right, here's what you can do and here's what you can't do. And so if you don't know, you do whatever you think is appropriate, which might get you into some problems. The last person in has to do what, a song and dance routine? Everyone say hi to Andrea. Andrea, say hi to everybody. Andrea works for me. She keeps me in line. Well, as much as anybody can. So you have this request for information, and part of the reason why people want to use this is the notion of what you put in specifications when you're not highly familiar with what it is that you're trying to obtain. And that is a little bit of a quandary at times. And so that gets back to the issue of, do you have to specify to begin with? The notion of design-based specifications versus performance-based specifications. And trying to remember what we talked about right at the very end last Friday, and I would know everyone was very anxious to leave at that time, including myself. And some people had experienced a little bit of difficulty with the weather at that time. And so we might not have been totally focused on what I was saying right up to like 2 minutes till 4. How many people weren't focused at 2 minutes till 4? So there were two questions that came up having to do with two specific scenarios and how do you take care of this. The one question had to do with when you buy a piece of equipment. Buying a piece of equipment, which traditionally, and I think almost inevitably, is going to be by a sealed bid procurement, since the only aspect that you're going to use to make the award determination is price, you have to say what that equipment is to be like. You have to specify the equipment in most circumstances. And so if you have to specify it in order to get prices that are comparable, then you have to know what you're going to specify. And the one answer was that with equipment, hopefully, and I'll take a shot at this, hopefully it's relatively standard for vendors to publish the information sheets of what their equipment does, what its features are, what it can do, what it can't do, and they try in their generic literature, their sales literature, to differentiate themselves from their competitors. You can always get sales literature. You can always get generally available materials. So if they have sales brochure, if they have generic literature, even without a request for information, you can call up a vendor and say, do you have a brochure you can send me on your equipment? And they can do that. And you have no problem whatsoever with something that is not customized for responding to you. Yes?
Do you call the vendor or the manufacturer? Because there could be, say, 10 vendors, and then if you call somebody, then they might say you're favoring them. Would that happen?
The question is, do you call basically a wholesaler or a facilitator, installer, et cetera, or do you call the manufacturer of the equipment? And from my standpoint, I'm just talking generically. That depends. If you're trying to find out the basic equipment that is from various manufacturers, you could do it either way. If you know who the manufacturer is and you can contact the manufacturer, you can call them. But by the same token, if you know there's a distributor, you can call the distributor, and maybe they are unique to one vendor, maybe they carry several lines, and maybe you can just ask them to send in generic. But you have to be careful about the generic aspect of it. Now, the second scenario had to do with a service, not buying a tangible piece of item, and that was data entry. And then the issue is do you really have to specify in great detail every aspect that must be done by a contractor? And I think Gary pointed out that you say you have to do this procedure, then you have to have a double-check verifying procedure, and then you might have a third procedure where, if I understand, the specification said do 1, then do 2, then do 3. But what I kind of threw out was the bottom line is you're not trying to buy those 3 procedures. You're trying to buy data entry, and you're trying to buy data entry that achieves a certain level of correctness, accuracy, like 99.9%, something like that. So maybe the issue is you don't have to specify all these intermediate steps, that you just say, we need data entry with 99.9% accuracy, and you rely upon the vendor to provide you information. Now, the first thing that comes with that type of scenario is you likely have to change the procurement method. I presume now you're doing it sealed bid? Yes. So, and that's what you have to consider. There are alternatives, and you have to figure out now, if I do it this way, what do I get? What do I lose? If I do it the other way, same thing. If I continue to do it by sealed bidding, then yes, I either have to do great deal of specifying, or another thing, even presumably you can do multi-step sealed bidding, again have a demonstration of accuracy, and maybe just let it go at that. Vendors that demonstrate that they can do the 99.9% with a technical proposal and demonstration pass, low bid wins.
Question.
Yes.
What is the significance? We do a lot of lump sum where it's electronically sent to the procurement officer. And when you were talking about sealed bids, is there criteria of what's sealed bid versus, because I'm not that.
When you say lump sum, you're talking about through email and marketplace?
Yeah, we put it out on email and marketplace.
That has to be sealed bid.
So when that's sent in electronically?
They are submitting a bid.
Okay, right, sealed bid, I'm not sure.
Well, sealed bid, competitive sealed bidding is a procurement method.
Okay.
It just means that when there's a finite date, when the bid has to be submitted to a specific location, and before that time and date, the bid amount is unknown. Now, normally, when you talk about sealed, we're going back to historically, you're talking about an envelope.
Right.
It's in a sealed envelope. With the advent of the electronic age, you have the same thing that has been accomplished through email and marketplace. They will have basically an electronic lockbox that the bid can be submitted, but it is not accessible until that time and date. And then it's open and you can see.
I really didn't consider that electronic transmission of the lump sum, bottom line price as a sealed bid.
That the procurement method would be sealed bidding unless the procurement method is small procurement. So if it's under 25,000, it's a small procurement, but small procurement can still be done by sealed bidding or sealed proposals, etc. Okay, so just going back to this notion of you look at the flexibility that's available. And so rather than do a request for information, rather than trying to get great detail, could you just go to either competitive sealed proposals, multi-step sealed bidding, something else that does not require the same level of detail of specifications? And the downside of that is then there's more work in terms of evaluating what comes in. So just some alternatives. And let me say the other alternatives, which is what I'm going to add in the slides the next time. You can have actual public dialogue with vendors relative to specifications. And what I mean is you can invite vendors in to have just a discussion about things such as, well, what would you suggest that I specify, or what can you tell me is available? And the rules there are you have to invite 2 or more vendors to this. You can't just invite them one at a time. This has to be with multiple vendors present at the same time, so that presumably they're a check and balance on each other. The other thing is that the recommendation is you have the actual session transcribed. So you have an actual verbatim transcript of questions, answers, etc., which is available for anyone else to get if they request it or if it's sent out to them. They can see what was discussed and what was recommended, etc. So that's something else you can do, but again, and supposedly, not supposedly, the Ethics Commission has ruled that as long as you have this public dialogue where you have invited multiple vendors and you have them come in so they can participate in an open discussion with at least 2 of them present, it doesn't violate the assisting with specifications limitation. The problem that I can see there is if you invite 2 or more and only 1 shows up, then that might be a little more problematic, but you get around that by transcribing. So these are the kind of things that you can think about, and if you think you want to do it, you need to talk to your attorney, because you need to make sure he or she is comfortable with this, gives you guidance on what to do, what not to do, etc. But want to keep emphasizing these options are there. They exist. You just have to put everything in the proper perspective and use them when it's appropriate. So I don't know if I've done this to the point of too far, but anyway, request for information. So now we're going to focus a little more on the aspects of what is a competitive sealed proposal procurement. What does it get you? What does it look like? How do you have to construct it? And this is still going to be very general because we have a 3-day class on sealed proposals that goes into, again, great detail on how you do a sealed proposal procurement. But when you're in planning and you're trying to decide, should you even do a sealed proposal procurement versus a sealed bid procurement? Should you do a request for information? You need to have some basic information about what these procurement methods get you, what they cost you in terms of effort, etc. So I'm going to make a plug for competitive sealed proposals. It's, I guess, my favorite procurement method. I've been doing it since 1981, I guess. Yes, since 1981. Probably have done 500, 700,000, I don't know. Who knows? Long time. And I did go over this at about 2 minutes till 4 last Friday, and so we'll go over it again because I know most people were not focused on it. So in a sealed proposal procurement, the only requirements, and we're going to go through these bullets, you need to state what it is you're trying to get, what your objective is, because you're always going to say what it is you're trying to get. The overall objective goal to be achieved. Identify any required activities, what they have to do. And we'll go through this probably in about 15 minutes more on that. You have to put the evaluation criteria. What are you going to specifically look at from vendors' responses to decide whether those responses are good, bad, neutral, whatever? You have to get a price. In some fashion, you need to get a price from the vendor. Now, the prices do not have to be absolutely comparable the same as they do for a sealed bid procurement. Because in sealed proposals, for the most part, you're not telling the vendor great detail. You're telling them, here's the problem to be solved. And theoretically, not more than theoretically, vendors can come in with very different approaches to solving that problem. And they can offer to solve that problem to a greater degree. And so because they can offer to do this in different methods, they can charge different amounts of money based upon what they're offering to do. And you don't have to go with simply the vendor that's the lowest in price. What you do in sealed proposal is you pick the vendor that is the most advantageous offerer. The vendor that is, I guess the typical shorthand description is best value. Who's giving you the best combination of what they're going to do and what they're going to charge to do it? So that's the exact opposite of low bid wins. So you have to have price. You have to state the relative importance of technical evaluation factors and price versus the technical offering. In other words, all you have to say is technical factors are worth more than price, the same as price, or price is worth more than the technical response. That's all you're required to do, but you do have to say that. You have to give the relative importance. And I will at this time use the plug for the memo that the Secretary of Budget and Management sent out in May of this year. Sometimes I have to think what year we're in. Sent out in May that said the default position of anybody who's doing a services procurement in Maryland going through budget and management should be the technical and financial factors have equal weight. So that is what you should start off, that they will have equal weight. We will let you without one iota of dissent, and in fact with encouragement, to say that financial can have more weight than technical. We will certainly let you say that price is more important. If you want technical to be more important, you have to give us a justification of why you think that is absolutely necessary. And I will tell you, the odds are that we'll say, well, thanks, but we've heard that before, and we don't think that that is necessary. Because if you take the sealed proposal class, a lot of people have what I call misconceptions of how you do sealed proposals and what you have to do, and the fact you have to handicap the technical being worth more than financial to compensate for these vendors that come in with lowball bids. And if you don't do this compensation of technical more than financial, then you have to take the lowball bid. And the answer you're going to get if you take the sealed proposal class is that isn't true. Now, I don't want to go into great detail there because that's another class, and we're already not going to get through this class in 5 days, so I'm not going to take more time.
Question.
Yes?
I have not heard you consider in all your proposals and discussions of procurements and so forth, the performance of a contractor on past contracts as a
Well,
rating.
why don't you wait for about 15 slides, and you'll hear me talk about that. We'll count whether it's 10, 15, somewhere between the next 10 to 20 slides. Well, maybe 20 to 30. Sometime this morning. Let me put it that way.
Technical and financial, and I just, was a little biased.
That is an aspect of consideration that we are going to encourage you to look at. All right, let's see. Relative importance, state of multiple or alternate proposals are permitted. And all you have to do is say they are or they are not. Well, not all you have to do. You have to say if they are or are not. If you say they are not, that's the end of it. If you say they are, then you have to say how the vendor is to submit them, any limitations. We will go over this a little more either this afternoon or the fourth day as far as these alternates, not to a great degree, because again, that's in the sealed proposal class, but at least mention what is the difference between a multiple proposal and an alternate proposal. But again, we're just saying what the characteristics are. And mandatory clauses. You got to have all the mandatory language, plus the language that just is what I call the housekeeping. When are the bids due? When are the proposals due? When is the pre-proposal conference? Things of that nature. So that's what is necessary for a sealed proposal procurement. And if you look at these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 or so elements, there's not a great degree that you have to put in there, So that means you have flexibility to be very frugal in the words that you use and what you specify, etc., and allow the vendors to be creative in their responsive. So I'm saying all this because now I'm going to show you an illustration of how unstructured and flexible sealed proposal can be, and why I recommend that you simply do a sealed proposal rather than RFI most of the time. This is the legal research procurement by the Office of the Attorney General in 2002. And I put out written by Bill Kahn because Bill Kahn has been retired about 4 or 5 years now. But Bill Kahn he was called within the legal community and within the procurement community, the Mighty Kahn. As you can see, not too far of a stretch on the name. Because Bill Kahn was this guy, if you remember Columbo, the Columbo show, Bill Kahn reminded me of Columbo. He's kind of short, very unassuming, very low key, but the guy knew everything. I can remember one time when he was involved, we had a situation, a very sticky legal situation, where our attorneys, and Bill Kahn was the chief of contract litigation in the Office of the Attorney General. So he was the chief procurement guru of the state. And one time our attorneys wanted some additional assistance. They went to Bill Kahn and asked him to assist. And in the space of about a couple hours, he wrote a document to go to a particular vendor that when I read it, I like, whoa. First of all, the fact that in 2 hours someone could write something that meticulous, but also he basically told the vendor, don't you threaten us, because if you do, here's what we're going to do to you. And then went on and said what we were going to do to them. And I had never seen anybody in the state basically put it on the line to the vendor and say, if you want to go there, here's what you're up against. And to the point that he asked me and a couple other people to review this for accuracy of content. And we had a vendor assisting us, and the vendor sent back email comment and said, are you sure you really want to say this? I would suggest that you change this language to diffuse some of the starkness and the accusatory nature and things like that. And his response was, I didn't ask you to edit my words. I asked you to tell me whether it was factually correct. I said what I wanted to say. So if there's no problems with the facts, your job is done. Thank you, goodbye. So that's the guy we're dealing with here. And so the Mighty Kahn. So anyway, he was the procurement officer. And in this particular sealed proposal procurement, what they put in the specification, first of all, is for legal research, online legal research, which if you heard of Westlaw and Mead, what is it? LexisNexis and Westlaw. There are only 2 vendors that do online legal research. The attorneys, whenever they have cases, they always try to find precedents. Where has there been a case of this nature before? What has been the decision? What can I take from that decision that I can use to argue in my particular case now? So the lawyers always have to do this research, and they used to do it with law books in law libraries, and now they do it with online research. So this was to get a contract for online research, which they've already had contracts. This was just a new procurement to get a new contract. And whereas historically what you did was say, we want a 5-year contract to give us this, this, and this, give me a price. What Bill Kahn did in this time was say, we don't want to specify either how long the contract's going to be, we don't want to structure how they're supposed to give us prices, All we want to do is say, we want a contract for online legal research. And say, make me an offer. And literally, that's what it came down to. Here's what we want, make me an offer. And what they had to do was identify what they would provide. The offers had to say, okay, here's what I will give you. They had to put the price for what they were offering, and it was a price per person who would access the online research, and state how long they were going to offer that price, i.e. the vendor would say, I'm going to give you this for 3 years, for 5 years, for 7 years, and without the Office of the Attorney General specifying how long the contract was. So, online legal research, now that's all you need to know. Everything else, you tell me. The RFP stated neither alternate or multiple proposals would be acceptable. And if you think about this, this is rational. Since I didn't tell you anything, I didn't tell you how you were supposed to give me online research. I didn't tell you how long. I didn't give you a price structure. If I'm not telling you anything that you have to fit inside the box, there's nothing for you to give an alternative to, because anything you say is whatever you want to say. There were 2 or 3 evaluation criteria, and one of the evaluation criteria was, how long is the contract? How long are you going to have this price firm? And basically what it said is the Office of the Attorney General will pick whichever offer was judged to give the best deal, and had mandatory clauses, etc., and that was it. It was a very sparse document. They received 2 proposals. There's 2 vendors that do this. They got 2 proposals, not rocket science. Proposals were formally evaluated by an evaluation committee. There were written questions, requests for clarifications, a best and final offer. The firm selected for the award offered extensive services for rates that would be firm for 7 years. So one vendor offered, for 7 years, I will give you this deal, this package of offering. The other vendor, I think, was 5 years or less. So obviously, 7 years with a very good package of what would be provided was a very good deal. So again, the RFP contained the mandatory clauses, only about 5 pages of actual specifications. And when I say actual specifications, things such as the pre-proposal location, the pre-proposal conference, location and date, the bid proposal due, location and date, etc. So all of that, everything aside from the mandatory clauses was 5 pages. And you think that you have, what, 40, 50, 60-page RFPs, much of which is mandatory clauses, attachments, etc. But how many times do you have, aside from the mandatory portions, 5 pages covering everything for a sealed proposal procurement? That just shows you how little was actually specified. No pre-identified duration, no pre-prepared structured price form, and as we've already identified, that met the requirements for a sealed proposal procurement. And there was an evaluation. The Office of the Attorney General said then, we'll tell you even now, because when I had these slides, and these slides are reviewed by one of our Assistant Attorney Generals, and my original wording was, the Office of the Attorney General thought they got a great deal. And she crossed off the thought and said, no, we did get a great deal. So everyone in the AG's office was very happy with what they got. So I took out thought, and they got a great deal with a very unstructured solicitation that just said, make me an offer. They even got a protest from the second vendor who wasn't selected, who brought up all these things of the unstructured nature. And it's okay, well, what about this didn't you realize when you submitted this to begin with? So, protest denied. We have an unstructured solicitation. We got one vendor who gave us a much better deal than another vendor. We picked that vendor. You're unhappy, you should have given us a better deal. And so they denied the protest, and the vendor didn't appeal it to the Board of Contract Appeals. And I can remember at the time, because since this is a service, it went through DBM, so we were very much aware of this. And I can remember, don't these people know this is Bill Kahn they're protesting against? Don't they understand that It's like saying that, I don't know, pick somebody. This is like saying that Einstein doesn't know how to do math. So that's just my analogy. Let's see. The procurement was okay this way because there were only 2 national firms that provided these services. The scope of services were relatively narrow. It was already well known what services these firms offered in their typical pricing formats. The only question was which of the services would they bundle together and how long would they hold their prices firm. So it wasn't as if they went out and said, create world peace and let it go at that. It's not a typical state procurement, but it shows that under the right circumstances, functional or performance specifications, which this supposedly is an example of what this was. The hallmark of performance-based contracting are better than design specifications as a general rule. That doesn't mean you can always do it, but that is like the ideal. And it also shows the full flexibility of the sealed proposal procurement method. And if you're doing a performance-based contracting, it has to be done by an evaluated procurement.
Question.
2 questions. We'll start up here.
First off, this allows the potential vendor to basically design their own specifications.
Question is, this allows the vendor to design their own specifications within the context of it has to be online legal research? Yes.
Right. So how do you prevent, this was limited because there were only a couple organizations that could do that type of work.
2 national firms that
But
do this, yes.
On a larger scale, how do you prevent a lot of minutia coming in terms of vendors from everywhere?
All right, well, the question is, how do you, if it were other than this situation where you only had 2 vendors and it was a relatively well-known activity they were providing, what would you do following this same scenario of basically specifying nothing because you can get all kind of responses and just be overwhelmed with both the number and in particular the difference of what one vendor provides versus another? My first answer is, if you have something that isn't very narrow like this, you may not go this way. That what you have to decide in your planning session is, first of all, procurement method, and secondly, if you decide sealed proposals, how much do you specify? Because what I'm going to say maybe shortly, or at least sometime today, is you usually are not going to have this scenario where you can just say, give me whatever you want, anything goes. Usually you're going to have circumstances where you're going to say, I have to have this. So, and you go and you decide everything you must have with the emphasis on must have. And so you structure it hopefully so that you can, as much as possible, prevent something where it's totally unmanageable. And the other thing that you can do is, well, you have to use discussions with sealed proposals. So you can try to get through that during the process, but the more unstructured it is, the more you have to do an evaluation. So it's a thing you realize by knowing what is involved in each of these activities. In the planning stage, you decide, can we do that? Can we leave it unstructured? How much do we have to specify? If we have to specify everything, should it be sealed proposals, or should it be sealed bid, or should it be multi-step sealed proposal? And there's a lot of things you have to decide. And I know what we typically do is, okay, how did we do it the last time? If we did it sealed bidding, we'll do it sealed bidding the next time. And one of the things I hope to plant in your minds is, don't always just do it the way you did it before. Look to see what should be changed. What do you think will give a better result than what you did before? If before was perfect and nothing has changed, then do it the same way. But if there's anything where someone says, well, gee, I wish we could have had this, or I remember the problems we had the last time because we did or didn't do something, well, then don't do it that way the next time. Change it to try to get a better result. Another question.
One of the things I've been questioning as I'm working out of Spring Grove is what I call the first 12 pages of our specification, which are boilerplate. And I'm trying to determine, is there a master boilerplate schedule somewhere that's updated, because it's not my job to come up with the different boilerplate requirements. That's, as far as I'm concerned, between the Attorney General and the major procurement personnel to establish a listing of boilerplates. I get into the detailed specifications or what required, and not all the other. Is there a master boilerplate?
Is there a master boilerplate for the state? No. There have been recommendations many times to do that, and agencies resist being told there's one way to do it. Is there one for DHMH?
When we have a small procurement, there are mandatory terms and conditions, boilerplate if you will, for procurements under $25,000. When it goes over $25,000 on a commodity and it goes to DGS, they attach their stuff to it. When it's a service, we have terms and conditions that would attach to that document.
Is that available as a document, the boilerplate for one and the boilerplate for the other?
It is. Unfortunately, it's hidden, but it is.
Okay, I'll be in touch with you on that, because all I'm doing is just using what was, in past specs, and I don't have any idea whether it's correct or not.
We'll have to get everybody a good link to that and the updates on it.
Yes.
Does this have MBE issues?
Pardon me?
Does this have MBE issues?
This particular procurement?
This type of procurement?
Well, this one for the online legal research did not have an MBE goal because there's nothing subcontractable about online legal research. Do you have MBE typically with a sealed proposal procurement? Yes. But MBE is not an evaluation factor. So that really shouldn't come into play with the procurement method or anything else. The only thing for whether sealed bidding or sealed proposal, the only thing from an MBE standpoint is you identify your goal up front, the absence, the presence, the amount of the goal, etc., whether there's going to be sub-goals. You put that in your specifications. You put the necessary forms for them to respond and say they're going to meet it, they're not going to meet it, what MBEs they're going to use, etc. With either a bid or proposal, you have to determine whether they have returned the proper forms and have returned them properly completed. If they have, you go on and continue and make an award the way you normally would. If they haven't, they're eliminated 90% of the time. There is very little ability to do curing of MBE flaws at submission time when you open a bid or proposal. But if they've done it correctly, at least with the initial review, you go through and do whatever you would do to make an award, and after you make the award, then you get further documentation, but MBE doesn't come into the actual evaluation. Does that answer the question?
You read my mind.
I read your mind. Okay, let's see if I can read 35 minds. Let's not see if I can do that. Most state sealed proposal procurements aren't this clear-cut. Often there are aspects covered by law or regulation. So obviously if you have a law or regulation that says something has to be done a certain way, then it has to be done. You're going to specify that. Many times you know through trial and error what has worked and what hasn't worked. So if you've already done the trial and error and you're comfortable, very comfortable, that you know what is the best way to do it, specify it. Factors that dictate what an offer must provide without the state having to redo activities. All right. We have a given piece of equipment. We've already bought it. We've already installed it. We already have people trained on it. That if we allow someone to come in and offer to provide a different piece of equipment, then we'll have to buy that different piece of equipment. We'll have to have retraining again. We'll have to install it again. We'll have to incur additional expense. So sometimes because of those aspects, you say it must be compatible with, which as soon as you say anything of that nature, you're already eliminating some vendors potentially from the marketplace. But you're making a decision that this has to be that way. Now, one of the things I'm going to say in a few slides is, but only say that if you absolutely must say that. And sometimes even after you say that, you can allow alternate proposals for a vendor to come in and say, yes, I will meet your specifications, I will do what you say, so I will give you a proposal that complies with using that piece of equipment or that software program or whatever. And then after that, if you've allowed for an alternate proposal, they can say, okay, here's what I will give you if I meet your specifications, but if you allow me to deviate from that, to give you an alternate approach, here's what I would give you, and here's what it will cost, and here's what it will give you, and you can at least decide whether in the end result that might still be a better deal than what you specified. And I know sometimes when I speak like this, it's hard for you to follow what I'm saying. We'll go through that in another couple slides, so I'll just reiterate that alternate proposal type of scenario. So think of what you have to say: compatibility of hardware, software, processes, personnel limitations. If something requires 2 people, 2 dedicated people, and you don't have 2 dedicated people, well, then maybe you can't use it. You have to specify something that can be done with what you have. And these type of circumstances usually require some degree of prescriptive or design type specifications. But they should be as minimal as possible, perhaps allowing for alternate proposals, as we will discuss later and as has been discussed a couple times already. Focus on what is being specified. Now, here's something I really want to emphasize. This is what I call the way to try to focus in on this thing of say what you have to say, but only say what you have to say, and really think about whether you have to say it. So, number one, and this is, I mean literally, ask yourself when you write something or before you write something, or if someone else has written something and you're reviewing it, sort of ask these questions. Do I have to say this? And then, okay, and these are some of the things you look at to help answer that question of do I need to say it? Does this requirement directly and positively impact the achievement? Do you have to do this to get to the end objective? Or, no, you can get to the end objective without doing this at all. I.e., you have to get to Chicago. Am I going to tell you to get to Chicago that you have to drive out Route 70 to Route 68, 68 to 70 and tell you how to get there, or just say, get to Chicago? And sometimes we get very detailed in telling you how to get there, when in the bottom analysis, that has nothing to do with getting there. So ask yourself, do I need to say this? Does this requirement or wording needlessly limit offer responses? Are we building a box around what vendors can give us? And sometimes you do, because you need to have things, but sometimes we say things, and when you really think about it, do I need to say this? No, I don't need to say this. If you don't need to say it, don't say it. And I realize it's easy for me to say, don't say what you don't have to say, and it's a lot harder to figure out when you're actually writing specifications, what do I have to say versus what I don't. But at least do this critical analysis and try to think about what is necessary versus what isn't. And that's another part of having multiple people in a team to review and to contribute. Maybe someone else will question the necessity of certain words or requirements, etc., and then you can debate whether they are appropriate or not appropriate. Can I rewrite the requirement in a less prescriptive fashion, with less detail? What harm will be done if I didn't say this? What would be the downside if I don't say it and thus don't get it? How much will I lose, if anything? And if the bottom line is I'm not going to lose anything, don't say it. If an offeror did not propose to do what is being considered to be specified, might there be compatibility problems, violation of security procedures? Like if you're Department of Public Safety, you have very prescriptive rules and regulations of what vendors can do or not do on premises. You have to control access to prisoners. You have to control the ability for them to bring in contraband, all kinds of things. And so there's no question that they have to be very, very prescriptive. If you're at Perkins, you have to be very prescriptive about on-site delivery of services, etc. So those are circumstances where you have to be. Most people, most other locations don't have those considerations. So only say what you need to say. We have state information technology security protocol, I think it's called. You have to follow that because it's been determined that is the safeguard to prevent infection of state computers with viruses, etc. So you're not going to deviate from that. You're going to specify you must follow the state information technology security protocol. So no question about things like that. Lack of coordination. If you don't specify that you have to do something, if you have more than one vendor that somehow is involved in a larger project, that you want those vendors to work together. So oftentimes you have to specify something so that what one vendor provides is usable by another vendor. If you have that, specify it. Inability to meet required time frame. Obviously, if something has to be done by a certain time frame, a contract's expiring, or the legislature has said something has to be done, you're going to specify that time frame. But look to see, other than what is required, do you have to do it? Generally only specify what the contractor needs to do and maybe how and when to do it. If there likely would be undesirable consequences if a contractor did not perform an activity in a specified fashion or time frame. And I realize I didn't really read that the way I should have read it. So reading it again, generally only specify what the contractor needs to do and maybe how and when to do it if what is below there is what you construe to be the circumstance that exists. If not specifying it will allow an undesired consequence if you don't specify it. All right, continuing on. If timing or process is not critical, give offers the flexibility to propose how and maybe when they will accomplish the contract objective. So if timing or process is not critical, try to err on the side of letting the vendors have flexibility. And if you do that, you need to place the primary reliance on the proposal evaluations and the discussion process. Again, we're in the context of performance-based contracting, which means we're in the context of evaluated procurements, either at the very least multi-step sealed bidding or most particularly competitive sealed proposal. So that's where we're emphasizing to minimize specifications and maximize what you're going to evaluate. Let's see, relying on the proposal evaluations and discussion process to assure acceptable contract performance. So relying upon the first bullet makes it more important to properly inform all offerers of all information to be included in technical proposals. So I'm telling you what you have to do. If you're going to follow this unstructured specifications where you're not telling them what to do, then what it does is switches the primary workload to the evaluation phase. And in order for you to properly evaluate, the first thing you have to do is tell the vendors everything they're supposed to tell you. Tell them what they're supposed to tell you. What are they supposed to put in their proposals? You can go back in discussions and have vendors give you information that they didn't put in their proposal to begin with. But we try to minimize that by telling them what they're supposed to tell us to begin with. Now, as many of you probably know, you can tell them to a great degree everything they're supposed to include, and still many vendors won't. Well, at least it's one thing if you told them and they didn't give it to you, you can still go back to them, you can still allow them to do it. It's another thing if you didn't tell them to begin with. You're still going to minimize the effort if you up front tell them what to put in their proposals.
Can I give an example?
Gary's going to give an example.
We did a very large procurement for vital records in order to get a new birth, death, marriage, divorce, and fetal death system. The history of this goes back before I was even here, probably after Joel left too, I think. But nevertheless, the RFP for this was 5 inches thick. And in the RFP, there was one deliverable that said the system must be able to be viewed, in other words, the birth system we're talking about, the birth records must be able to be viewed from the local health department. Simple to understand, right? Vendor says, yes, our system meets this and demonstrated that it met it. Vital Statistics said, oh, well, we have something else in mind. It has to be able to be utilized by all of them at the same time. And it has to be able to download information to all of the 24 jurisdictions at the same time, even if they're accessing the same record. So what happened was that the vendor, and I blame the vendor for this, went ahead and attempted to meet Vital Statistics' expanded thought process on how this should work.
Was this during the specifications, before award or after award?
After award.
After award.
And
So they changed the specifications after award.
they thought they had their understanding of what those 5, 6, 7 words meant.
Ambiguity. We're coming to that.
And the vendor had a different one. And that has caused an awful lot of trouble in this contract. So maybe when it gets to ambiguity, the example will be better.
Yeah, that's probably a good one. Maybe I'll use that in the future. Okay, let's see. So relying upon proposal evaluation discussion makes it more important to properly inform offerers of the information to be included. You need to construct your evaluation criteria to allow you to properly evaluate what it is you're telling people to submit to you. And there needs to be what I call the three-way synchronization. We also call this mapping between, number one, what has to be achieved, the RFP objectives, requirements, etc. Number two, based upon what has to be achieved, then telling them what they have to give you as far as information to demonstrate that they can achieve that objective. And number three, your evaluation criteria that allows you to evaluate the information that they have provided to you, which demonstrates whether they can meet the base objectives. And sometime, I think in one of these classes, maybe the sealed proposal class, we actually have a little diagram of arrows that a continuous circle with each pointing to the other, because you need to have these things align with synchronization. So, and I realize, again, throwing this out is abstract, but again, if you have this in a slide, maybe later you can refer to it and it might make more sense when you're actually in a procurement context. Mapping means for each objective or deliverable specifically state by section what information is required to be required to demonstrate capability or compliance, i.e., give me this information in your proposal. This information must comply with the requirements of section 221. Give me this information in your proposal that will demonstrate compliance with section 222. So you're not just saying generically. We recommend you typically don't just generically say, give me a proposal that fully explains your capability to provide all requirements in the scope of work. We recommend that you go in more detail than that. Give me this information will relate to the requirement here. This information will relate to the requirement here. That you're going further and telling the vendor what they must include, with the hope that they will give you a more complete proposal to begin with, which makes it easier for you to evaluate, to make a selection. It saves time and effort later. The old pay me now, pay me later thing that I say over and over. And the other thing that is very, very, very critical, in sealed proposals, it is stated in regulation, you may only evaluate a proposal on the basis of criteria that you have put in the solicitation that the proposal will be evaluated on. You may not evaluate a proposal on any basis that was not included in the specifications. So what you don't want to do is have a situation where you have told a vendor to give you information in their proposal, and you go to look at it, and you can see that one vendor has done something better than another vendor, and then some wise person on the evaluation committee, or somebody, the procurement officer, or the assistant attorney general says, wait a minute, yes, I can see that vendor A is much better than vendor B in this particular aspect, but have we said anywhere that we will evaluate a proposal on that basis? And if you can't identify a criteria that allows you to evaluate a particular aspect, you are not allowed to consider that aspect. It's like when you see the trial on television, the court cases on movies and television, etc., where the lawyer will throw something out, and then there will be an objection, and the judge says, strike it from the record, and will say to the evaluation committee, forget you heard this in so many words. Just don't erase it from your memory banks. Don't consider this when you're making your verdict, etc. Well, it's easy to say, but how do you erase something you heard? So what you need to make sure is your criteria allows you to evaluate everything that you feel is important that you've told the vendor to put in their proposal. Because the bottom line, and I do this with evaluation committees sometimes, hopefully not frequently, but if I'm sitting there and they're discussing things and they throw something out, and there's been times when I said, wait a minute, all right, I hear you discussing this, but now let's go to page such and such where the evaluation criteria are. And we have 5 criteria, let's say. Tell me which of these criteria, what you're discussing right now, fits into. And sometimes they can say, they look at it, and sometimes they'll go, oh, I think clearly it's within this criteria, and here's why. And if they do, and it sounds reasonable, I'll say, okay, now we know it's within the criteria, but now we also know it is criteria number 3, which is the third in terms of importance, so we have to consider it as the third most important issue, not first or second. Sometimes it's come back with, well, I don't think it fits into any of those criteria. And then my answer is, then we stop discussing it because we can't consider it. So when you're doing your planning, you have to take all this into consideration, and you have to make sure you tell them what they have to do, the objective, tell them what they're supposed to tell you, and then you tell them that you're going to evaluate, and what you tell them you're going to evaluate it on is there, so that you can actually use that in the evaluation.
Joe, can you change that during a BAFO?
Can you change the criteria during a BAFO? You can change the criteria, well, the answer is yes and no. With sealed proposal, in stark contrast to sealed bidding, you have some ability to change specifications after the receipt of a proposal. Obviously, in sealed bidding, once a bid comes in, since the bid is specific to specifications, after the bid's in, you can't change the specifications. If you don't like the result you got, the only thing you can do is cancel it, do it over. In sealed proposals, you do have the ability, within leeway, to change things in the specifications, and those things can be the evaluation criteria within a window. And that window is that there has to be a determination by the procurement officer, and usually we go to our assistant AG and make sure they're comfortable with this, that changing the evaluation criteria will not be construed as trying to change the rules to favor a particular vendor. In other words, now that we've seen what the vendors have put in their proposals, we like a particular vendor, and we think if we evaluate them simply on the basis of what we said to begin with, we may not be able to pick that vendor, and so we're going to come up with a different evaluation criteria that allows us to focus on what this vendor gave us so we can get that vendor. That's a no-no. That's what you're not supposed to do. So what you have to construe is what you want to change or what you want to add does not necessarily favor or disfavor, unreasonably favor or disfavor any vendor. If the procurement officer thinks that's the case, if the assistant AG thinks that's the case, then the odds are, yes, you can do a modification to the RFP followed by a BAFO. BAFO is best and final offer. So if you change your specifications, you must follow that with unless it's an insignificant change in specifications, you must follow it with a request for a best and final offer so the vendors can now give you a price based upon the revised specifications. That's flexibility. Obviously, if you can change the specs after you have proposals, that's a lot more flexible than not being able to do that. So everything depends on the circumstance. And what you also try to do is anticipate, if we make this change, do we think some vendor is going to perceive that we're trying to favor another vendor, and thus we'll file a protest. If we think it's highly likely we're going to get a protest by doing it, I wouldn't do something I think is likely to result in the protest. So, flexibility you have to consider. Mapping illustrated, let's see. We do more on mapping in the pricing class. An effective way to reduce prescriptive or design specifications in sealed proposals is to make aspects that would have been specified into evaluation criteria. And this is something I recommend all the time, that I read something where a vendor says, this has to be this way. And an example is, the offeror must have 5 references of 10 years in duration where they have done at least $5 million worth of business in the activity of the RFP. And so you have set by specification what the vendor has to do. And I've used, hopefully, very extreme example, 10 years experience, 5 references, whatever I said, $10 million, whatever. That probably is going to get to very few vendors meeting those requirements. And what I try to get agencies to do is, you don't have to specify that in a sealed proposal procurement. You simply say, tell me your experience. And then you can evaluate which vendor has the most experience exactly like what you're seeking, without saying a word about what that experience has to be. That's something that frequently happens, because I see these requirements all the time for minimum experience requirements, both of duration and dollar value and things of this nature. And the first thing I'm going to do is, do we have to specify that? And the usual answer is yes. If we don't specify that, we're going to get people coming out of the woodwork. We're going to get 20, we're going to get 50 responses. Because people are going to say, if we don't have any minimum requirement, anybody and everybody can come out and offer this. And what I say is, how likely are people going to, are vendors going to go to the time and effort to construct a proposal that they really have no valid ability to do? That typically we don't encounter that if you don't specify, you're going to get 50 and 100 responses. So do you have to specify references? And sometimes we compromise. Sometimes we have very, very minimal references. In fact, later on in the class, we go over this thing about minimum offer requirements and say, as a general rule, I think we'll talk about later. But it's just an example of what you may take from being specified to simply evaluating. And just see how many things can you take out of the you have to do it this way to we will evaluate what you do. Can't be done in sealed bidding. Again, maybe the fact that you can't do this in sealed bidding means you do it by sealed proposal. Just telling you some of the rules. Focus, performance-based contract. The focus is a description of the high-level results or outcomes to be achieved, i.e. the performance or functional requirements. That is the focus of performance-based contracting, rather than the means to achieve the outcome, the design requirements. And these are just examples. So you could have an assignment looking at the first bullet, the white part below it. So if your assignment is deliver 1,000 bags of wheat, okay, that's a very concrete assignment. And I'm going to use this as kind of like an exaggeration. And you can stop at just 1,000 bags of wheat, but the reality is, why are you trying to get 1,000 bags of wheat? You're probably saying deliver 1,000 bags of wheat because somebody needs fed. They're hungry. And if they need fed, then maybe that's the objective we need to focus on. Maybe in the interim we deliver the 1,000 bags of wheat, but maybe we also need to focus on how do we help people be self-sufficient? How do we help them grow enough grain to feed themselves, things of this nature? So high-level objective is dealing with the hunger to begin with. The lower level objective, perhaps a very narrowly tailored specification, is deliver X amount of wheat to X amount of location. Going to the second one. We could say there's a specification that you will provide a reading instructor who will be available 5 hours a week at such and such location to provide remedial reading instruction to up to 5 students, etc. So that can be a very specific, narrowly tailored specification, but the real objective is we're trying to increase reading skills. So maybe individual tutoring isn't the best way to increase reading skills overall. Maybe you need to change the whole reading curriculum in schools. Obviously, one is a much more complicated objective, much more difficult to achieve, much broader in scope, but the other thing, really, when you get to it, is simply a subset of what the overall objective is. Same like we did last, the first day of the class, the thing about objective of the congestion. If the objective is reduce commute times, that's the objective. A road might be a means to reduce commute times, or maybe a road isn't the best way to reduce commute times. So you need to focus on the objective versus something less than the objective. In each of the situations on the preceding slide, presumably performing the specific named activity will help achieve the desired end result, but is not the end result itself. A vendor presumably would propose a different approach to achieve the overall end result than it would to simply provide the identified intermediate activity. And this is where the old saying comes in, give a man a fish and he eats for a day, teach a man to fish and he eats the rest of his life. What is the objective you're trying to accomplish? So instead of redoing, I said this a number of times, redoing each procurement in the same prescribed manner that was done before, actively seek to change the focus, to fundamentally change outcomes or the impact accomplished in planning through your team approach. Going to start on the topic of incentives and disincentives, because these are aspects of performance-based contracting. And how many of you have heard these terms before? How many have heard the term incentive? How many have heard the term disincentive? You've heard both? Good. How many do them? Okay, we'll see. Incentives and disincentives, these can be monetary or non-monetary. Incentives are positive rewards for a contractor that achieves or exceeds certain goals. So you tell them what they have to do to the extent that you specify something. And then if they do something markedly better than that, some reward for having done better than what was expected or required. And a disincentive is the opposite. When a contractor doesn't do what they're supposed to do, they lose something. Something is taken away from them, or something is denied to them they otherwise would have had. So incentives and disincentives. Disincentives are often thought of as penalties. And having said the word, for the most part, I want you to banish it from your memory. We are not allowed to have penalties in contracts. It is illegal. It is a violation of law. And most people use that word. In fact, I get sort of incensed when I read reports from the legislative auditors that talk about the need for agencies to put penalties into their contracts because there are not sufficient penalties to dissuade the vendor from not doing things or things of this nature. And we've had our attorneys write letters to the legislative auditors saying you can't have penalties in contracts. So I'm going to try to get it in your minds and differentiate penalties from damages. One's okay, one isn't. All right, a penalty is something that is inflicted on a contractor in a procurement context. I'm saying what it would be. As a punishment, penalty means a punishment for failing to achieve a contract requirement. but penalties are not permitted. We cannot punish contractors. And you can do it in law. If there's a violation of criminal law, if there's a violation of civil law, you can have punishment. Punitive damages, things of that nature. You can't do it in contract law. And I remember back about 2 years ago, Gary had a class in, performance-based contracting. And he invited my dear friend, Scott Livingston. And most of you don't know Scott Livingston, but Scott Livingston is the antagonist of procurement people of the state of Maryland. He is a lawyer who is probably the foremost lawyer who represents vendors protesting state procurements. So when I say my good friend Scott Livingston, it's like saying, yes, my buddy the devil. Not that Scott and I don't like each other, except for we're on the opposite sides of the table. But anyway, Gary invited Scott to come to the lunchtime of this particular class because people ate at their tables. And I happened to be sitting in the front row here, and Scott was up explaining the difference between criminal law, tort law, and contract law. And Scott's a fun guy at times. And so Scott said, well, let me demonstrate. I'm going to tell you what these things are, and then I'm going to demonstrate. And he said, all right, criminal activity. And he walked up, and I was sitting right there, and he hit me in the arm. And he said, that's a criminal act. And he didn't apologize. And then he had a pen, or an eraser. I think it was an eraser. And he said, and then there's torts. For instance, if I... And he hit me with the eraser. If I accidentally, just because I'm throwing my arm around and have something in my arm and it accidentally flies out of my hand and hits someone, that's a tort. Contract, and in those things, you can have penalties, you can have consequences, you can go to jail, you can have damages and punitive damages, things of this nature. For criminal, you go to jail and you have fines. For torts, negligence, he was trying to demonstrate negligence, you can have both actual damages and punitive damages, and often punitive damages are more than the actual damages. And then after these little examples, and after I'm like, okay, thanks, Scott, what else are you going to do to me? Then he said, then you come to contract law, and you can't do any of those, either of those. All you have is the ability to try to get actual damages. And so I've always remembered that. So it was an effective demonstration, at least for me. Not that I needed the demonstration, but I'm telling you what he did. Okay, so you can't have penalties, but you can have damages. Agencies always can and should not pay for performance. So I want to differentiate not paying a bill that is submitted because the vendor didn't do what they were supposed to do to get the payment is not damages. It's simply they didn't do it, they don't get paid. So damages is beyond not paying for non-delivery. And we discussed that extensively in Perform. So not paying for not receiving is not a disincentive. Damages, definitions. As per the National Institute of Governmental Purchasing, damages is compensation, usually monetary, for injury or damages to goods, person, or property. Then there's another form of damages called liquidated damages, which some of you, maybe many of you have heard of, but most people don't understand. And I will say that again. Most people don't understand the concept of liquidated damages and what they allow, what they don't allow, how you do them, etc. So we will do something about liquidated damages. All right, liquidated damages. Damages paid usually in the form of a monetary payment agreed by the parties to a contract, which are due and payable as damages by the party who breaches all or part of the contract. May be applied on a daily basis for as long as the breach is in effect, may not be imposed as an arbitrary penalty. Emphasize, and I probably should have emphasized that, may not be imposed as an arbitrary penalty. The key to establishing liquidated damage is reasonableness, and I did emphasize the word reasonableness. It is incumbent upon the buyer to demonstrate through quantifiable means that damages did exist. Let me go through some other definitions before I start talking more. The National Association of Purchasing Managers, this is their definition: liquidated damages. Damages to be paid in the case of a breach of contract, a sum agreed upon during the formation of a contract, which will be paid by the breaching party in the event of a defined breach. And the thing I particularly liked was the next one from the National Association of Purchasing Managers: penalty clause. An inexact term referring to a clause in a contract that specifies the sum of money due in case of contractual default. Such a clause is in reality a liquidated damages clause and cannot specify compensation in excess of the actual injury sustained by the injured party. Courts will not enforce a penalty on the defaulting party. Right in the definition from the National Association of Purchasing Managers. You can't have penalties. And what happens when you say, for instance, I saw just, I think about Monday or Tuesday of this week, a proposed liquidated damage from an agency that said that for each day that an MBE report was not submitted past the required time frame, they were going to assess liquidated damages of $1,000 a day. So if your MBE report is due the 10th of the month, and if come the 11th of the month we don't have the MBE report, we're going to assess $1,000 against you. Now, I will simply ask the question, does anybody think there's actual damages to the state of $1,000 if you don't have an MBE report one day later than you have specified? Hopefully most of you has said no. I heard a number of you say that.
Knowing the state bureaucracy, it could be very easy.
Obviously, and actually when I talked to this agency, well, I really want them to get that report in, and I figured I would put the liquidated damages high enough that I would get their attention, and so they're really going to do it. And that means that you're making it a penalty, and you can't do that. Liquidated damages are only what you actually are going to be out if it isn't done. What are you, and we've actually gone through this with the attorneys, and we said, okay, what is the value to the state? What is the state going to incur if you don't have an MBE report one day later than it's due? And the answer is probably nothing. Probably one day after it's due, many agencies don't even note it. Many agencies don't even follow up and require them, unfortunately. So if there's no damage, you can't have anything that you get from a vendor.
Yeah, but wasn't that a requirement for allowing them to have the contract in the first place?
They're supposed to do it. But liquidated damages means that you are quantifying the harm to the state by them not doing it.
Well, couldn't I write them a letter and say they were in default of the contract?
Okay.
That was part of the contract's agreement.
But what is your harm if it isn't there?
They're default. They're not performing.
That doesn't say they didn't meet the MBE goal. They didn't give you a report that showed they met it, but they could have met it.
That was a requirement of the contract that they provide a monthly or weekly or daily report.
Yes, it was.
If they don't, they're in default. That could be a $10 million contract.
You could call them in default if on that circumstance you thought it was a default situation.
I mean, I'm not belittling that, but contractors, stretch wherever they can.
Contractors.
You've got to draw the line sometime. And because I've terminated a couple contractors over the 10 years because it took me 12 to 15 months to do that, to spend all the time wasting documenting their lack of performance, have DGS sit in on it and all that kind of good stuff, and we finally got them out of here. Okay?
Default is a possible remedy. And if the non-performance is severe enough, that is certainly a possibility. We also discussed that later in this class and in Perform. Let's see. Damages assessed against a contractor due to non-performance might be considered a disincentive, but damages can be pursued with no special provision in the contract. I want to emphasize that. You don't have to say a word. There is no standard clause. There is nothing that is advised to you that says if a vendor doesn't perform, we have the right to collect damages. That is simply an element of contract law. That if anybody doesn't perform a contract, the vendor, a party who is not enjoying the benefit they were supposed to receive can go against the party that was supposed to provide something and seek damages. And what damages means is I'm going to seek something that will make it the equivalent as if the vendor had done what they were supposed to do. That's what damages is supposed to do, be an equivalent value to a contractor providing what they were supposed to provide. And you don't have to have a clause, and there is no clause that says we can go after you for damages. There has to be a clause if you try to specify liquidated damages, because liquidated damages in advance sets the target. It says, here is what I will deduct from you if you don't do this aspect. And here is what, $100 for this, $500 for this, $50 for this, X amount per day, X amount per minute. If you have a IT system and it goes down, you can have liquidated damages of $1,000 a minute if it's a huge network that will interrupt thousands of customers. And it's established in advance so both parties know what the circumstance is, and if the circumstance isn't met, what will be deducted, what will be the damages. So that's what liquidated damages do. And the one thing that I will say is you cannot have both damages and liquidated damages for the same aspect of a contract. If you specify liquidated damages, you do not have the option to try to collect actual damages. And if you do not have a liquidated damages clause, then you can't say, oh, I'm going to decide to arbitrarily charge you X amount of money. You can pursue actual damages, or you can specify in advance liquidated damages, but you can't do both. Yes?
That on slide 306, where it said agency always can and should not pay for performance that doesn't meet requirements. Let's say that in order
This
for
clause
you-
right here.
Yeah. Let's say you put into where the vendor had to send you report on a quarterly basis. And in order for you to get paid, if we don't have the report by certain time, if you submit an invoice, you will not be paid until the deliverable are met for that quarter. Can you put something in writing to that effect?
Question is, an example is a quarterly report. And so you have a quarterly report that's supposed to obviously come in quarterly, I guess around April 1st,
Yeah.
July 1st, etc. So if you don't get it, what can you do? And the question is, can you put that if you don't get that report, that there will be money withheld? First issue is how you structure your pricing. If the report is a deliverable, then you can have them give a price to produce the report. And then if they don't give you the report, if they've priced it out at $5,000, you don't pay them the $5,000 till you get the report. Maybe in addition, you might have liquidated damages as well, but at the very least, if there is a price for a specific aspect that is not performed, you don't pay the price for that aspect until it's performed. So that again goes to structuring. How do you get the prices? So the more you have it segmented so that you can identify specific activities, specific values for that activities, specific time frames, then yeah, they don't do it when they're supposed to. You don't pay them until they do it. Maybe you pay them less because of liquidated damages, but you don't pay them at all until they do it.
So if, let's say, if we tell a vendor, a contract, let's say $20,000,
20, okay.
You then receive 50% upon award of the contract, and the balance is payable after the report is due.
His example, again, going to a report, can you structure the procurement so that it's various payout points? X amount upon award, X amount upon, let's say, a preliminary report, X amount upon completion of final report. Can you? Yes. Should you? Yes. Except that typically you would not pay any money upon award. The general premise is we don't pay until we have at least something of value. Now, I realize here at DHMH, if you're in a human service program, you usually do pay in advance. That's a different type of scenario. You're dealing with nonprofit vendors that need the cash flow, and so you have it structured so you pay generally 15% or so in advance, something like that. But aside from that scenario, the general premise, no rule, there's nothing you're going to find in Title 21 that says this, but the general thing is we don't pay until we have something of value. And so I think we do talk, I even think in this class later on, about that aspect. Should you pay in advance versus structuring progress payments, payment for intermediate deliverables, et cetera? Yes?
The contract at DHR that you talked about was structured like that, where we paid them a small amount initially, and when the DHR found the people a job, the company working for DHR found the people a job, they got another payout. If they were employed for 6 months, they got another payout. If they got a job with health insurance, they got another payout.
Okay. I realize we're after 10:30, so take a, what do we say, 15-minute break? 15-minute break.